Imagine a place where the boundaries of age, industry, background, and culture melt away, replaced by a shared desire to explore the depths of our collective experiences here on the open, shaded porch. Amidst an atmosphere of serenity and tranquility, leaders from all walks of life gather to share their stories, the stories that shape their very beings and doings. This is the Knowledge Mindfulness Porch with Laila Maroof.
Joining me on the porch today is Jessica Chen. Jessica is an Emmy Award-winning communicator, top virtual keynote speaker, and CEO of Soulcast Media, a global business communication training agency. Her LinkedIn learning courses on communication have been watched by over 2 million learners. And she's worked with Fortune 100 companies, including Google, LinkedIn, and HP. Jessica, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here.
Thank you so much for taking the time to be with us here today. And congratulations. Really, the book is out. Oh my God, Smart, Not Loud. I was so excited to get a copy. I was so curious to know so much more. So I downloaded the audio as soon as I could, and I started, and I couldn't stop, really. But let's start with the title, which I love, Smart, Not Loud. Where does this word loud come from?
To understand why the book is called Smart, Not Loud, I think it's really important to understand my upbringing. And I grew up in an environment that might resonate with a lot of people. I grew up in a very traditional, conservative environment. My parents were immigrants here to the U.S. A few decades ago, but I was born here in the U.S. And not surprisingly, when they first immigrated here to the U.S., they raised me and my brother to embody what I call quiet culture traits. And we can certainly dive into the details of that. But long story short, quiet culture traits are traits and behaviors like listening more than speaking, keeping your head down, working hard, studying hard. And it was their belief that if you embodied these traits, these quiet culture traits, not necessarily being loud, boastful, or aggressive, that was how you get ahead. And I think in many ways that there might be like an immigrant mentality to this. But fast forward to after I graduated university and I started working, I started as a broadcast TV journalist. So I was already entering what I would consider a very loud culture workplace. And I found that a lot of the traits that I was taught by my parents, the traits that I was raised in, didn't necessarily set me up for the success and visibility needed that's often expected when you work in a fast-paced corporate environment. And so that's why in this book, from a high level, I wanted to teach folks who might have grew up with those traits of humility and modesty. And it's not about changing who you are. It's about kind of figuring out how to show up in a work that's smart, but still get noticed.
I think really this resonates so much with my upbringing, believe it or not. That's why I was very curious to know, the terminology of loud and quiet. Where did this come from? Because many of the stories in the book, a lot of the characters, the people you interviewed, so much of what they were doing and feeling and saying was so much to do with my story too. So I kind of, this whole humility and, not showing a lot of your hard work because, you can't talk and brag about so much of what you're doing, because that's not the way we're brought up. We're brought up to think that this is not nice or this is not the way to go. And when I read those stories, I felt, oh my God, Jessica, this is so much me a couple of years ago. And it took time for me to realize, not that these traits are good or bad or all that, because I realized myself that everything can be good or bad in different situations, as, of course, we'll dig deeper inside. So let's go to the word smart. Smart. What do you mean by smart here?
I strategically chose the word smart, not loud, because I wanted people to feel that this was a skill in terms of getting noticed at work for the right reasons. I wanted people to know that this was a skill. And you just said this. I think for some of us, and let's kind of like share this. Like, you can certainly struggle with getting noticed at work and not be raised in what I call a quiet culture. It might just be your personality. It just might just be like who you are as a person. It's not in your nature to be that loud, dominant, aggressive person. I mean, we certainly have folks like that we see on our team. And gosh, like it comes so naturally to them. They're always the first one to speak in a meeting. They're not afraid to raise their hand. They're not afraid of rejection, right? They just kind of put themselves out there. And I think for some of us, that just in and of itself feels very uncomfortable. And so the message that I want people to really embody is to know that getting noticed at work for the right reasons is incredibly important for unlocking the bigger opportunities at work. You know, I remember early on, I was always of the mentality of, well, if I just work hard, that's enough, right? My work, it should speak for itself. My manager should notice. And the truth is, that's just not how the world works. Your manager is busy. They have things to do, projects, they have their own deadlines. Heck, they're even thinking about their own career and, their own career advancement. And of course, a good manager will always think about you. But when it comes to really advocating for yourself, you have to be the one to do it. So the reason why I chose SMART is because I think a lot of how we should approach our career takes strategy, it takes tact, and it also takes really good communication skills. And that's why this whole book, I really believe it's anchored in communication skills. And that's what I teach now. And I think if you don't talk about how to level up your communication skills, a lot of the learnings of, yes, advocate for yourself, a lot of it can feel very theoretical. And so I wanted to make sure that this book was grounded in communications. How do you ask for what you want? Like, really, how do you ask for what you want? How do you use your body language, your tone of voice? But even beyond that, how do you even think about shaping what I call your career brand? And in some ways, it's synonymous with your reputation, what people think of you. But I dive into teaching people how exactly to do it. And I think all this is SMART.
I like that. I really like that. For me, SMART, I don't know, coming from the lens of knowledge mindfulness, I think of SMART always as a higher knowledge maturity. So that also combines the wisdom, that higher level of understanding yourself and the world and how the interplay goes, using this to navigate the world, using your understanding of who you are and all that. So a lot of this messaging, that in a way manifests in the communications that you're talking about, where knowledge mindfulness, it manifests also in your behavior as a leader, in your decision making. So focusing on communication is amazing because it is part of that manifestation of, who you are and how do you see yourself in the world and all that, which is also really great. But let's go back to when and why did you decide to voice all that out? I mean, you've been going through for years, coming from that quiet culture with your experiences and background. But why and when did you decide, okay, Jessica, this is the time. Now I want to come out and share everything I learned with the world out there?
There's a story that I started the book with, and I think it perfectly embodies that. I call it friction, that culture shock that we experience when we start working it. And the story was actually shared by one of my friends who I interviewed for the book. And he was telling me how early on in his career, he was this, very ambitious, like go-getter kind of like person, like that's what he wanted, right? But he, similar to me, he grew up in a very conservative Asian American home. And I remember he was telling me the story of, he was seeking a promotion, or at least, he was working really hard to try to get that promotion. And, when performance season came along, his boss gave him pretty good reviews. He didn't get the promotion. it was like the ball dropped and he was like, what the heck happened here? And so the story goes, he goes into his manager's office and, he wants to know what happened. I mean, part of it is also because he wants to improve. He wants to make sure, to fill any gaps. And he was like, hey, I'm just curious, why didn't I get that promotion that I had initially asked for at least, a few months ago? And then his manager walks over to the whiteboard, grabs a, dry eraser marker and starts drawing these circles on the whiteboard. And he starts talking to him about, as the manager, I have within these circles all these things going on in my life right now. Circle number 1, I'm thinking about my own work and making sure I do it well. The other circle, I'm thinking about our clients and making sure they're happy. The other circle, I'm thinking about my family and making sure that we take care of A, B, and C. I'm thinking about my kids in this other circle. I'm thinking about my dog, my dogs and cats in the other circle. And the whole point of the story was that he, as a manager, had so many things that he was responsible for. And the last sentence was what really hit him. He was like, I know you want this promotion. I know it's important to you, but you have to actively come into my office, talk to me, make sure it's top of mind. And I remember when I heard this story, it really hit me because it went back to that default of, I used to think the same way. It was similar, like, I consider myself very hardworking. I consider myself pretty ambitious. Like I have aspirations and goals. Like I think many of us do, right? But I think a lot of times we just assume that just doing good work is enough. And so, it's funny because when I started as a journalist, even though it was a completely different industry than, what this story came from, it was exactly the same dynamic because at the end of the day, we're working with people. People are busy. They are often making decisions what's most top of mind. And they call it the relevancy bias. And it's just kind of like just knowing that in and of itself is really the first step. But I think where a lot of people get stuck is, okay, I hear what you're saying, Jessica. I know putting myself out there is important, but how? And I'll share another story because one of the clients that I worked with really early on when I first started my company, Soulcast Media, she was telling me that she works in private equity. And in private equity, a lot of very alpha type of personalities, again, go-getter types. And she was on the quieter side. And so she was like, you know what? Maybe I just have to be loud. Maybe I need to be loud. So she started talking really loud in meetings, trying to mold herself to be very aggressive, being the first one to insert herself into the conversation. And she said she tried to do that, but it felt very unnatural. It felt very awkward for her, right? Sometimes she would say like, she'd share her idea and she would notice it wouldn't be necessarily received the way she wanted it to be. And so by the time she came to me, she was like, I know being just quiet, for example, not talking about the work I'm doing is not working, but I also know being extremely loud is completely uncomfortable. So she wanted to find that middle ground. And I think, that's the essence of this book. It's really letting people know that you don't have to be loud in that, even that auditory way to get noticed. And so I want people to feel like if that's something you struggle with, you're not alone.
I like that because again, that middle ground of, when can you voice? It doesn't even have to be loud, like real loud, but it's just voicing your, opinion or you're just sharing what you think and all that. But I'd like to play a little bit the devil's advocate here. When you were talking about the first story of the manager and having his life and dog and family and all that, I thought about that for a second. And thinking that I think the difference between good leadership and a manager is that a leader would notice people that work, in ways that produce results, at least. I don't want to say hard or smart or I don't want to label here. But at least as a leader, I would know my people. I don't have to wait like I'm here, raise my hands, I'm here, I did this and that. So what do you think of leadership versus management and how it affects knowing and noticing people who are doing their stuff, who are really putting their hearts and souls in their work? What do you think of that?
That's a great question. And there's a whole section in the book, which I call the quiet culture bias. And the quiet culture bias is the perception that because someone tends to be maybe on the quieter side, because they tend to be more humble, more modest, or maybe they don't speak up much in meetings, right? We always know there's folks who are on the, again, quieter side in meetings. The quiet culture bias is remembering that just because they are a little bit more quiet, it doesn't mean they're not engaged. It doesn't mean they're not interested. It doesn't mean that they don't have aspirations or ambitions or that they wouldn't want to also get on that project. Maybe for them, asking once they thought was enough. Maybe even just asking once was pretty hard for them. And I think if we think about being amazing leaders, amazing managers to our team, it's making sure that we don't just default to who was the loudest, who talked to me last, who was the one that like talked the most in the meeting. And again, I get it. As a manager, we are also juggling a million things. And it goes back to just kind of like, okay, yeah, when you're like, filling out that paper, putting that person's name, thinking about that promotion, yes, many times it is going to be that, quote unquote, louder person. But I think if we want to be great managers, it's making sure we look at everyone, both the more extroverted person as well as a more introverted person. And that's what I call really trying to break the quiet culture bias, because I think it's easy for us to assume, yes, just because someone is more quiet, oh, maybe Jessica's not that interested. Maybe she doesn't really care. But I think a good manager, a great manager will talk to this person, really understand that person's aspiration, carve out time to meet with them, right? And I think that's what I want people to also understand. And I will say, in writing this book, I really wanted people to understand people who grew up in a quiet culture much more. I don't think there's a book like this, honestly, out there. I know there's tons of communications book we know, but I really think this book is not just for my quiet culture folks. It's really for folks who might be more on the loud culture side to better understand their quiet culture colleagues.
Yes, and I love the word understand, because I think, again, coming from a knowledge mindfulness perspective and lens, I always think of how sometimes this biases comes from a place of fear. I don't understand you. I don't know about you. So that's where my biases come. When you don't know something, that's where I think this whole bias, and that's where also my question for you is, how do we work on these biases? What's your advice for a leader who wants to work on, he's aware or she's aware that, okay, I grew up in a Western culture, I'm working in corporations, this is what I'm used to. And now I'm aware that, no, maybe this is not right. Maybe I have to change that. But how do I do that? That's the big question.
Yeah, well, you said the first word, which is truly the most important one, which is that self-awareness. It's knowing that as humans, that's probably what we default to. We go to what was most recent. And I think awareness is number one, to know that that might be our initial gut instinct of that's how we make decisions. That's how we, perceive the world, perceive our team, perceive people on our team, right? But then the next step is, how can we make it a habit to try not to fall into that quiet culture bias? And for me, I'm really big on, just for myself too, how can I keep important things top of mind, not just tasks, but even just like if I'm trying to adopt a new mindset, if I'm trying to even learn something new. For me, I don't know about you, but I'm a huge Post-it person. So anytime there is something that I want to remember, or I want to always see, I will write it down on a Post-it note and I will tape it near my computer. So I don't have too many, but I do have a good number of Post-its all around my desk. And these are maybe like inspirational quotes. These are kind of like things that I want to keep in mind. But it's really, in visualization, I think is really, for me, it helps a lot. If I see it, if I read it, then it becomes part of my nature. And so I think if we're thinking back about, okay, how can leaders really be more inclusive and really think about, both our quiet culture and loud culture? Yes, awareness is number one, but it's also making sure that you remember, like, okay, wait, before I really send off that final recommendation, or before I choose who I'm going to promote, or before I make a decision on anything, did I actually do a thorough job in evaluating everyone? Did I make sure that I included every single person on the team to really gauge fairly that I made the best decision, right? And I think in a time where many of us are so busy, we're just trying to like check things off our to-do list. It's easy for us to rush into making decisions just so we can move on to the next thing. But I think going to your point, it's really as a good manager, kind of taking a step back and really trying to make the most fair decision, not the quickest decision, I think is the most important.
I like that. I really do. But if we go back to the employee himself sitting there in a meeting room, try to figure out, okay, now, when do I say this? How do I say this? What's your tips? You have really, really great tips in the book, I know. And I would love you to share some of those.
Yes. So I will say for somebody who tends to be on the more timid and quiet side, that moment and finding that moment to chime into meetings is probably one of the hardest things to do. And I know this because I used to be that person where I would sit in a meeting and that meeting would be dominated by 2 to 3, 4 people. And then 45 minutes, the meeting's over and you never said anything. And my whole thing is you have to try to say at least one thing in a meeting. And if it's not saying verbally one thing, and let's say we're virtual, for example, because I know many of us are still virtual, how can you still show that you are participating and engaged in that meeting? Maybe it's using the chat function, right? Maybe it's as simple as you turning your camera on so they can see your face. All these things are very small, simple, but subtle cues that form the impression that you're participating, that you're engaged. So going back to your question of, okay, but how can you chime in? So first of all, I want to say that is fantastic in the sense where I hope that is your mindset. And so I have a sequence in the book, which I call the 4A sequence. And I'm going to go through the 4A sequence because this is a way of approaching speaking up in a meeting, especially when it feels a bit difficult. So the first A stands for active listening. Now, a lot of you are probably, well, of course, listening, right? But I will say the difference between going into the meeting and actively listening is passive listening. And I think sometimes we go into meetings thinking, okay, we have this 2:00 meeting. I know kind of what it's about, but it's not my intention to say anything. And I think when you go in instead with an active listening mindset, you are actually totally showing up in that meeting in a different mindset. You're actively listening because you're looking for that split second or whatever moment to chime in. So that's the first one, active listening. Now, once you've found that opportune moment to chime in where maybe folks are talking about something that you can add value to, then the second A is acknowledge. So acknowledging is a very seamless but strategic way of putting your voice into the conversation that doesn't necessarily feel abrupt. So you can say, oh, Jennifer, that was an interesting point you just made. So just that, those few words is how you can acknowledge the person who just spoke before you. Oh, Ben, that idea reminded me of, right? So you're basically acknowledging. And what is so powerful about this, and we know this, when people feel heard, when people feel acknowledged, they feel like they don't have to be defensive, right? And so when you acknowledge and make other people feel heard, then they almost kind of give you that runway to share what it is you want to say. And then the third one is what I call anchoring. So anchoring is very strategic in the sense where anchoring is where you repeat 1 or 2 words that person just said. Oh, Jennifer, you mentioned project A, B, and C, and it reminded me of this study that I read. So you're repeating the project ABC that she said. Or, Ben, you mentioned, Jasmine the other day, and I'm using the word Jasmine because he said the word Jasmine perhaps a few seconds ago. Anchoring is how you can connect your thoughts to their thoughts. So it creates a seamlessness in conversation flow. And then finally, the last one is answer. Answer is just where you make your pointed statement. And if you look at this 4A sequence from a bird's eye level, it's honestly a very strategic and intentional way of approaching conversations, active listening, acknowledging, anchoring, and answering. And for me, I use this all the time when I'm talking, and it completely transforms how even confident I feel when I'm trying to speak up in a meeting.
I agree. Effective communication opens channels between you and the receiver, creating a smooth and energetic flow. And that's key to what you're saying. All right, we have to pause here. But next time, Jessica Chen, author of Smart, Not Loud, will share insights on the AI revolution.
This is where I think we have to double down on the genuine, authentic human connections so that we can stay closer together. So that's kind of how I think about it in these two lenses. It's seeing all this rapid fire information that's coming out, allowing us to really critically think about it, understand where the sources are from. Is this really true? Where else can I go to try to balance out the things I'm reading so I'm getting both perspective? But the other thing is, because there's so much information coming out, and because a lot of it is so automatic, sometimes we can lose that human touch.
You have been listening to the Knowledge Mindfulness Porch with Laila Maroof. If you want to join the movement of knowledge mindfulness and shape the world of tomorrow, go to drlailamaroof.com. The Knowledge Mindfulness Porch is a production of Forbes Books.